uranium, a stable geography, a mostly stable liberal democracy. For the last 22 years, it has been a prohibited technology. We're the only G20 country to do that. And I think in especially a time where, with the challenge of climate change and also the challenge of trying to maintain a reliable Australian energy grid, nuclear power is the massive elephant in the room. And as far as I'm concerned, the prohibition is a national disgrace, and the sooner we overturn it, the better. My talk today is going to be a sort of a quick 10 or so minute case for nuclear power. I'm going to race through some fairly introductory stuff, and then pass on to David, and then on to Bob, and then we're sort of aiming to try and get a good chunk of question time in at the end. I've always found the best way to think about energy generation is in terms of what probably called a modern energy trilemma, and that's sort of puts a requirement, I guess, on the nature of your generation sources on your grid to be one, affordable, secondly, reliable, and third of all, clean, non-polluting, and also low carbon. Traditionally, at least in the 20th century, Australia probably had a grid that it was envious of the world. It was cheap and as reliable as they came, and it was largely dominated by coal. Coal and gas, certainly a reliable source of energy and very affordable, but they probably don't make the requirement of clean. Coal is obviously very high carbon and also highly polluting, and emissions from gas are nowhere near as bad as coal, but such that it couldn't be considered a clean energy technology. I guess the next two to consider that have sort of got increasing penetration on the Australian grid are solar and wind. They've definitely become affordable, particularly in the last couple of years, and they're certainly low carbon. But being intermittent and diffuse sources of energy, they are not reliable. This kind of leaves us with probably two other main ones, and that's nuclear power and hydro, and they're probably the only two that really tick all three boxes. Obviously, the costs argument is not certainly a binary thing where it's affordable or not. There's scales of grey here, but at least if done right, its nuclear power is all three. Hydro, you could also argue, also fits all three requirements, but is limited so far as to what your geography has, and in some cases can't be scaled up to the same extent than some of these other generators can. What does Australia's energy consumption mix look like? 2007, 2008, this is basically what it looked like. The energy consumption, so this is not electricity, this is entire energy consumption, primary energy consumption, and it was over 6,000 petajoules. This is predominantly in fossil fuels. Obviously coal for electricity, gas for electricity and industrial use, and then oil predominantly for transport. Only about 6% is renewable on as far as an energy consumption metric. I think it works out to be about 34% of Australia's energy use is in electricity, 19% is in transport, 18% is in stationary energy, and a lot of that is sort of fuel burnt for in various sectors, and I think about 7% corresponds to industrial processes. One big challenge of decarbonisation is cannot be just confined to the electricity grid, of course. We have transport and industrial processes which need to be the focus of our efforts going forward if we're serious about decarbonisation. So it always makes it's important to consider the energy consumption rather than just our energy mix when talking about these challenges. Why nuclear? What makes it so special? I think anyone that sort of dips their fingers into the topic realises that it's the energy density of nuclear fuel that gives it such an incredible advantage over any other form of energy generation. So the best anthracite coal, I think, energy density is about 24 megajoules a kilo. Oil is a bit higher and gas a little bit higher than that. So But when you come to considering a kilo of natural uranium in a light water reactor, that energy density jumps up to 500,000 megajoules a kilo, which is quite incredible considering that jump from normal fossil thermal generation up to nuclear fission. If you were to put that same natural uranium into a fast reactor, you get another 50-fold jump yet again, so 28 million megajoules a kilo. What does this actually mean when it comes to generation? Well, a good little comparison I sort of discovered was a 10-gram uranium oxide pellet, which sits in a fuel assembly in a modern light water reactor. That's equivalent to about a ton of coal. About a ballpark estimate of a one gigawatt coal plant goes through about 10,000 tons of coal a day, which is quite an incredible stat. When you compare that to the equivalent in uranium, I think fissile uranium-235, you use about 3 kilos a day in comparison to 10,000 kilos of coal. Again, the equivalent of that 10-gram uranium pellet, 481,000 litres of natural gas, or 454 litres of oil. So it is energy density defined. How do renewables? Renewables don't fare very well at all when it comes to really talking about energy density. The average, I think, global wind energy is about 1.5 megajoules per square metre, and for solar at the equator at lunchtime at sea level, you're looking at about 0.001 megajoules a square metre. So they're diffuse sources of energy, and this is the principal challenge with them, and of course they're also intermittent. Doing a similar comparison for renewables, the equivalent amount of renewables required to produce, say, 1 gigawatt, the output from a 1 gigawatt nuclear plant. For solar, it's something like 11 million solar panels, and for a 3 megawatt turbine, 939 turbines to produce the same amount of energy. So that has a lot of ramifications for sort of resource use and obviously land use required to produce the same amount of energy. I think it's always useful when we're sort of talking the merits of different technologies to obviously compare them with a useful metric, and using energy produced, say, in megawatt hours provides a pretty good way to do that. As I'm a scientist, I'm quite interested in the data behind these things, and it's probably what led me to become such a passionate advocate of nuclear power. First of all, I guess there's a number of things to consider. Carbon emissions is one, and nuclear power, according to the IPCC, is pretty much comparable to offshore wind. It's 12 grams equivalent CO2 per kilowatt hour. You see that's about 4 times, about a quarter of that of solar PV, and obviously much more significant than a lot of the fossil forms of generation. As far as sort of safety, we're very quickly to point to some of these, small number of nuclear catastrophes. But if you actually look across the whole history of the industry compared to in time, the electricity that's generated, it is still the safest as fatalities per generated energy. This continues, and it is only going to new reactors are only getting safer. The energy density also has an important effect on actually the amount of materials required to produce that same amount of energy. Nuclear being so dense requires much less amount of material, but it's concrete, cement, steel, than all other forms of generation. Likewise, land use to produce that same amount of power, nuclear power needs a much smaller footprint to produce that same amount. Obviously, compared to wind and solar, you need significantly large areas of land. In some places, that's all right, where there's not high demand for different parts of land use, but certainly in busier populations, there can be a bit of a fight for that land. So I think from a conservation perspective of both resource use and land use, it's really a strong argument to pursue nuclear on those metrics. Probably one common criticism of nuclear is that it takes too long to build, and those people that are particularly passionate about action on climate change will try and dismiss nuclear power because, oh look, it takes a few years to get these plants up where we can build a solar farm in a year to 18 months and get that going. We should just focus on these renewables. But if you actually interrogate the data and again look at it from a generation perspective, nuclear trumps renewables when it comes to actually being able to build up large amounts of generation. We saw it in France and Sweden in the 80s, and also the UAE. That's a projected total that I got from the World Nuclear Association, but they'll be coming online in about 2 years' time. So they started their industry from scratch. So it's a kind of a promising example to show that, you know, if we need to build it and we need to build it fast, nuclear is the generation form to do it with. Of course, we have to talk about waste if we're talking about nuclear power. This is a very common image, often shared by the likes of Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, about what they seem to try and spread the word about what people think waste should be, but it's actually nothing like that. Nuclear waste is actually poorly called that. It should actually be called spent nuclear fuel, or maybe even future fuel. It's actually quite boring. After sitting in the reactor for about 18 months, 2 years, it's then transferred to spent fuel pools for a couple of years, and then onto this dry car storage in most cases. In some countries, they do reprocess, but at the moment, with uranium being quite cheap to pull out of the ground, they just sit in these casks. They're kept out of the biosphere. They're monitored by nuclear engineers on a regular basis, and nothing happens. I think in the 18,000 cumulative reactor years of civilian nuclear power generation, we have not had one serious incident associated with spent nuclear fuel. So it's a myth that persists, but yeah, the truth is actually a bit more boring. And you know, while some people call it waste, in fact, when the economics is right, it's going to be fuel for future reactors. So we certainly have a solution for nuclear waste, and anyone that says otherwise doesn't know the full picture. Just as a quick comparison, I looked at sort of the total waste usage. We produce about 2.5 kilos of hazardous waste per person per week on this planet, or 90 kilos of industrial waste. But if you look at high-level radioactive waste, of which spent nuclear fuel is actually in a small proportion, I think it works out to be about 30 milligrams per person per week. So it's a tiny amount, and it's confined and well understood. So there is no problem with nuclear waste. Alternatively, some other generation processes don't take full commitment of their waste, and we're seeing these problems now, particularly in solar and in wind turbines, where there's no real concerted effort to deal with the whole life cycle of the panels or the blades when they're finished and they're going into landfill. In the case of the e-waste of solar, there's lead and cadmium in there that can potentially risk water tables. So it's certainly a significant problem that needs to be dealt with. Just quickly kind of wrapping up, Australia, we're kind of in a unique position given there's quite a promising nuclear renaissance going on around the world, and I think now's the time to sort of embrace this technology. We've got a pretty clean slate, so we can certainly take advantage. There's Generation 3+ light water reactors being built around the world, which are sort of make even the Generation 3 seem to look ultra safe. Small modular reactors are starting to be seriously considered across the world. We have high temperature gas reactors, which is probably some of the more probably well understood Generation 4 designs. China's likely to start one up and connect one to the grid probably within 2 years. In addition to these other interesting Gen 4 designs, metal-cooled fast reactors, which can burn waste, molten salt reactors, which a lot of people are quite passionate about, and then also micro reactors, which are very likely to have some very interesting applications in remote sites, and even perhaps on the moon and Mars as well. just to finish off, I think some people often think of nuclear power just as a source to make electricity, but in fact, it can actually do a lot more than that. As well as electricity, in many countries, it's actually used to desalinate water. In Kazakhstan, in India, and as the technology increases, we're going to find that actually becomes a cheaper and cheaper way to actually do it. Currently, the energy costs, the electricity cost for desalination is very, very expensive in South Australia. We've got a plant which I think only runs about 10 or 15% of the time on account that the costs are just too high. But if you can couple that with the waste heat from a reactor or just drive it thermally from the heat from the reactor, you can actually start making water really, really cheaply. And it's pretty obvious in Australia how beneficial this could become. In addition, of course, to the water, being a thermal source of generation, it's a great source of heat. With some of these high temperature reactors, there's some really, really promising cogeneration applications for nuclear power where you can couple together with industrial processes, which is normally uses fossil gas to heat in their industrial processes. So it's a very fast way to decarbonize these very carbon intense industries. And probably a little bit further down the track, but still a focus of significant research is the production of hydrogen and subsequent carbon-free fuels that can be made from hydrogen production using these high temperatures. So that's, I guess, a bit of a very quick overview of the case for nuclear power. From here, I'll hand over to David Limbrick, who's been quite instrumental in getting up an inquiry in Victoria onto nuclear power. It's certainly been the focus all around the country, these inquiries. So the dialogue is continuing. We've got people like David to thank for that. He's going to share his thoughts on that inquiry and how he's seen it thus far. So over to you, David.
Thanks, Stuart. Okay, I think you're still sharing your screen. Yep, great. Yeah, thanks a lot for that introduction, Stuart. And I'd first start by talking about, how I came about to care about nuclear prohibition in Australia. And the story's a bit interesting. I used to be quite opposed to nuclear power and nuclear energy in general. Like many people my age, I grew up as a child during the Cold War, and everything nuclear was associated with nuclear weapons and global Holocaust and annihilation through nuclear warfare and all of these sort of things. And like most people my age, we just had this inherent bias towards everything nuclear. But then something interesting happened to me in 2011. In 2011, I'm sure you'll all be familiar with the earthquake and subsequent tsunami and then subsequent nuclear disaster in Japan, in Fukushima. And I had a special sort of connection with that. My family is from Japan and I used to live there for a while. And like everyone else, I was freaking out about what's going on. I've got lots of friends and family in Japan. And even though, as Lloyd said, I majored in physics at university, but someone who majors in physics and knows about physics doesn't necessarily know anything about radiation and its effects on the body. And so you hear all these things coming up in the news about, millisieverts and, radiation clouds and all this sort of stuff. And I was worried. And so I was thinking, are my friends and family in danger in Japan right now? And I couldn't tell from the news. It was pretty crazy, the news reporting. So I started doing my own research and looking at it. And what I discovered was something that sort of forced me to rethink everything that I was thinking about nuclear energy. What I discovered was that actually no one from my family was in real danger. I also discovered that the government's actions in Japan that, evacuated people killed more people than the nuclear incident. In fact, no one died of radiation. So this was something that was quite challenging for me, and I had to rethink my views. And then fast forward a few years and I became involved in politics, and I started questioning Australia and our prohibition and why did we prohibit this technology federally and throughout different states, and became quite passionate in putting this option back on the table for Australia. And as Stuart mentioned, there's lots of lots of benefits to nuclear, and lots of countries around the world are benefiting from nuclear. And in fact, Australia is enabling them to benefit through nuclear. I mean, one fact that lots of people don't know is that Australia's uranium exports every year, we export uranium, which generates zero carbon energy equivalent to Australia's entire electricity production. So I know Australia gets a lot of, criticism from, all of the carbon emissions from the coal and stuff that we export, but we never get much credit for all the uranium that we export. And I've always found this, quite hypocritical of Australia. So when I got elected to Parliament in 2018, so I'm a member of the upper house in Victoria, one of two Liberal Democrats that was elected in 2018. The other one's Tim Quilty from Northern Victoria. I made it a goal of mine to do something about looking at prohibition in Victoria. So I think most of you will probably be aware, as Stuart's mentioned, that in 1998, there was a prohibition put in on new nuclear reactors for power generation federally. But actually, a long time before that in Victoria, back in 1983, we instituted our own ban on, actually more stringent ban on anything to do with the nuclear fuel cycle, including exploration for uranium and thorium, anything to do with processing of those materials, nuclear reactors, everything. So it's actually even a more stringent ban than the federal ban. And so what I decided to do was to try and get the support of the opposition. So in Victoria, the Labor Party's in power. So to get the support of the opposition and the crossbench in the upper house in order to get an inquiry to look at what might be the benefits for Victoria of lifting prohibition in Victoria. And to do that in Victoria, you may not be aware, the upper house is actually made up of a very large crossbench. So we have 40 members, and of those 40 members, at the time, there was 11 crossbenchers of all different parties. So, we have, Liberal Democrats, of course, there's two of us. We also have a Green, we have Shooters, Farmers and Fishers, we have Independents, we have a whole bunch of things. But also the opposition is actually the same size as the crossbench. So there's 11 opposition members from the coalition and 11 crossbench. So I needed to get a majority in order to get this over the line, because Labor wasn't going to support this inquiry getting up. And so we lobbied very hard, talked to many members on the crossbench. Many of them were neutral on it. Some people were against prohibition, were against nuclear energy and supported the prohibition, but were still willing to look at, having an inquiry and looking at the questions. And so I made the argument that, Victoria should look at prohibition. It was put in during a time back in the Cold War, like I was saying, when I was younger, that, the concern was all around nuclear proliferation, so nuclear weapons and safety. And so if you go back and look at the Hansard back in 1983, when they first brought that in, that's exactly what all the politicians were talking about. They were talking about, nuclear weapons, which of course has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, but that was always conflated. And, they were concerned about safety. And so we argued that, it's time to look at that, have things changed? Back then, it was quite interesting looking at the arguments. One of the arguments was, we'll never need this because we've got so much brown coal in Victoria that it will just never be something that's worth looking at. And, back then, people were worried about nuclear annihilation. Fast forward to 2020, that's all changed. So not many people are talking about, nuclear war and this sort of thing now. The new worry that everyone has is around climate change. And so the whole thing is completely changed. The big piles of brown coal that we've got in Victoria, that we've still got, many people see them as a liability. People, their social license in a lot of ways has been taken away. And so my thought was, it's crazy that we're eliminating or hamstring, tying our hands behind our back on certain technologies still for views that were, prohibitions that were put in during the Cold War. And so that inquiry, the vote was eventually successful, which was fantastic. So that succeeded back in August last year. Then following that, to try and maintain momentum and interest, I reached out to an organisation called Environmental Progress in the United States, and you may be familiar with them, but they're supporters of nuclear energy, and they were having an event in October called Stand Up for Nuclear. And the idea is to have positive pro-nuclear demonstrations around the world in lots of different cities, but there was nothing being planned in Australia. So I put my hand up to volunteer to help organise one in Melbourne, and that's what we did. So on 20th of October last year, we organised on the steps of Parliament. I can show you a picture. There was about 100 people that turned up, but it's Australia's first, I'll show you a picture now, Australia's first pro-nuclear demonstration ever. So hope you can see that. So there's a bunch of us standing there. So we've got a banner posted, all that sort of thing. So, that was good. And I'll be doing that again this year. And I hope that this year it'll be bigger and better. So, it was a really positive thing. And it was around the time you would have been aware that there was lots of these climate strike rallies and this sort of thing. So we tried to contrast what we were doing with the climate strike rallies. They were very negative, sort of end of the world, apocalypse, this sort of thing. And then we were trying to present a positive view of, what the future can be by embracing technologies like this. So I'll just go back and get rid of that. Okay, and hopefully that's worked. Okay. Can you see me again? So, whoops. Okay, we're back. All right. So that inquiry that I spoke about earlier has actually started now. We had our first hearings back in, first public hearings back in March of this year. We first met with, government regulators. So we met with ASNO and Department of Health and Human Services, these sort of things. But what was interesting is just recently, the inquiry had to be delayed and because of the pandemic situation. But there was our first 2 days, there was 2 days set up. One was all pro-nuclear people and the other one was all anti-nuclear people. And if you're familiar with the politics around nuclear energy, the people that oppose it, it boils down to a few things. They talk about, problems with safety, proliferation, which were the original reasons why the prohibition was put in place. But more recently, there's been a lot of talk about, price and cost. Is it just a distraction? Issues around whether it actually has a social license, and also talk about changing attitudes. As I said, younger people now are not worried about nuclear war, they're worried about climate change and these other things. And from my experience, they're remarkably open-minded about nuclear technologies. But there's been a sort of a push by anti-nuclear people to cast those proposing nuclear energy as some sort of culture war issue. So it was quite interesting that the very first witness to appear on the pro-nuclear side was the CFMEU, Mining and Energy Division in Victoria. So they're a union. They're actually aligned with the Premier in Victoria. So no one would be calling them right-wing conservatives or anything like that. But their members in the Energy and Mining Division, a lot of them are located out in the Latrobe Valley, and they work at the coal power stations now, or they worked at the ones that have been shut down. And their evidence was amazing. Like, they're like, okay, well, we want a secure future for our members, and they are quite open that they would prefer to build new coal power plants. However, they sort of acknowledge that the social license for that is fading and it may not be achievable. And therefore, they propose looking at nuclear energy to replace coal-powered generation in the Latrobe Valley in East Victoria. So very practical, very real concerns. You know, economically, things are pretty bad out there at the moment. A lot of people are worried about their jobs in the future at the coal power stations, and rightly so. Other witnesses we had were, I won't go through all of them, but a couple of them. So Australian Workers Union was another union that's very supportive of nuclear energy. They've submitted to the federal inquiry. They have similar thing, you know, why should this option not be on the table? And they sort of had a similar view to me on that. Also, we had another union, the ETU, the Electrical Trades Union. They're very against nuclear power. So we've got a bunch of unions. Some of them are very pro, some of them are against, which is quite interesting. We also had Australian Conservation Foundation and Friends of the Earth. Of course, they're against this. They've been against this for a long time. One of the things that I discovered when I launched this inquiry, I was expecting a lot of hate because, you know, I know that nuclear is controversial. But actually I didn't get it. And really the anti-nuclear people that were around in the 90s are really pretty much the same people that are there now. Like there's no sort of new anti-nuclear people around. So I thought that was quite interesting. But, you know, like I think the cost argument that people tend to discuss a lot is quite sort of irrelevant because cost isn't a justification for prohibition. You know, if we're going to ban things because they're expensive, it sort of doesn't really make any sense. And, you know, so I think ultimately we're going to have to come back to the safety and the proliferation arguments, which were the reasons that these things were prohibited in the first place. And, you know, clearly I'm convinced that, you know, proliferation's not a big issue and that safety can be managed. But the trick or the thing that we'll have to do for those that support this technology is convince the rest of the population, or at least a large enough proportion of the population, so that we get this social license to proceed with lifting prohibition and moving forward with this sort of technology. I really do feel that Australia is being left behind in this space. We have the ability to become a leader in this space if we choose to. And on that note, I'll hand over to someone, Mr. Bob Pritchard, who can tell you a bit about the industry view on this.
Well, thank you very much, David, and congratulations to you on the initiative you've taken down in Victoria to get this debate out on the open. And it's an honour to be on the same platform with you. And it's great to have had the opportunity of a technical briefing by Stuart on the how he sees the technical pros and cons of nuclear. That'll save me making a lot of these comments myself. And it's been done so much more authoritatively by you two that there's no need for me to go over it again. So everyone on this webinar will be pleased to know that you'll have a chance in just a few minutes to start asking your questions. So please get your questions ready. What I just want to say is that we set up this company, SMR Nuclear Technology, as a consulting firm 8 years ago. So we've been into this for 8 years, and our chief technical guy is given evidence before the Victorian inquiry and or has filed his evidence. He's yet to appear before the inquiry. His name's Tony Irwin. He actually was the commissioning engineer for 8 of the 16 nuclear power stations in the UK. So he's probably one of the most experienced nuclear engineers in the world. And he's on our board of directors. He's our technical director and he's our guru. What I'd like to say is that we as a company are of the view that the introduction of nuclear power to Australia could actually provide an economic and environmental miracle for the nation. Now, you might say, well, how do you mean a miracle? Well, I don't mean a sort of a miracle of God. I'm talking about a man-made miracle, because that's what nuclear can bring to this country. It can bring a totally emissions-free power system. Now, I don't suggest that you totally remove all the existing sources of power generation and replace them with nuclear overnight, but just have a go at introducing it slowly. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, but you do need to have a look at nuclear, because there are very big limitations with moving to renewable power. I have to say this about renewables. I support them, I like them, but they've got two problems that stick out to me. First one is that they're unpredictable, totally unpredictable. And the second thing is they're uncontrollable, totally uncontrollable. Who is there that can control a weather pattern? And that's what the renewables depend on. The problem too with renewables is that you'll have, if you introduce them, and they're finding this now, you have sites scattered all over the countryside. Now, a lot of people have started to realise that having sites scattered all over the countryside is all very well, but what about the people who want to consume the power? Now, just give or take a few dollars, it costs about $1 million per kilometre to put in a transmission line. That's a huge cost. Now, if you put transmission lines all over the countryside, you'll be spending a lot of money unnecessarily on transporting nuclear power to the sources of demand. The other thing I just would say is that the actual construction time for these new so-called small modular reactors is actually only about 36 months. But you'd have 3 or 4 years of very, very rigorous checking and verification and community consultation to precede that. But once you have the approvals in place and you've got the community backing, you can put them up in about 36 months. And the other thing is that we've got a regulatory system here already. We've got a top-class, world-renowned regulatory system run by Panzer. And so the regulatory system is already there in place. What I'm really saying is that Australia is in a position to look seriously at this alternative source. It doesn't have to be dominant, but it ought to at least be considered. The thing I would really like to emphasize is that this depends on the community. If communities don't want nuclear power, well, communities can tell nuclear power to go away, because no one's going to build a nuclear power plant unless they've got community support. But there's huge potential opportunities for far-sighted communities in the country towns or in the places like the Latrobe Valley and the Hunter Valley and North Queensland, where towns and cities can be developed on the basis of the nuclear industry in those places. So I see it as a big opportunity. That's all I really want to say by way of introduction. Now I'd be very happy to participate in the questions and answers. Back to you, David.
All righty. Thank you very much, speakers. Thank you very much, speakers. Apparently it didn't record too well when we first opened it up, but in the sake of time, we'll keep going. Bob, a question for you quickly. You talked about community and that sort of thing. All speakers crossed off on safety and how it generates jobs and that sort of stuff. So how can Australia get broader community support for this, for nuclear?
Oh, look, the first thing is the people have to be consulted. You can't just leave them alone there reading the newspaper and listening to the lobbyists. People need to be consulted. They need to be asked, are they interested in investigating the opportunities here? If they are, get them or invite them to run a public meeting and get them to invite the experts in to talk to them and so that they can learn for themselves directly. They shouldn't get secondhand information. And we as a company, SMR Nuclear Technology, are perfectly happy to come and talk to community meetings in country towns around the country and answer any questions that anyone's got. But the community's got to run this.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Bob. Social license is I spoke about it a few times before. It's the biggest issue, really. Technology, the technology's already there, but without community support, it will never get off the ground. And the only way to do that is to talk to people, not dismiss their fears. Their fears, you may not agree with what they think about it, but if people have fears about this technology, you have to address those fears and answer those questions. You can't just ignore people's fears about it and dismiss them. You have to listen to them.
Question here from Emmanuel Cross. It's probably a fairly broad question to all three panel members. Is there anyone on the panel that think that CO2 emissions are causing dangerous global warming?
Well, I'll put my hand up and say that I am not a guru, and I can't actually give an authoritative answer, but I think on the balance of probabilities, just on adopting the precautionary approach, we would be idiots if we ignored the risk to our environment, and so would the Chinese be idiots. I mean, the whole of the world has got to look at this as a potential threat to the environment. We've had this process going with the Framework Convention on Climate Change for the last 20, 30 years now. It hasn't really broken through, but on the balance of probabilities, and in order to be careful about our future and concerned about our children's future, we should be doing everything we can that's affordable to reduce the emissions. And that'll have to be done progressively as fast as we can afford it, but it may take us 25 or 30 years to get there. But certainly it's got to be looked at, and if it is looked at, certainly nuclear's got the potential to replace a lot of the old technologies in the future.
Yeah,
I interrupt quickly. We have about 8 minutes left in this session to go.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah, I mean, I have a similar position to Bob. I think that, there's clearly some issue that needs to be addressed. I'm not a scientist, so, on the science side of things, I'll defer to the experts, but regardless of what you think about the science, there is clearly a demand globally for low carbon electricity generation or low carbon energy generation. So whether or not you believe in climate change or think whatever you think about the science, the reality is that there is a global demand for low carbon electricity and energy production, and there is and high carbon energy production is on the nose and losing its social license. I think it's pretty clear that that's the case, and that's fairly that drives a lot of my reason for supporting nuclear energy.
Yeah, I totally agree with David. Yeah, regardless of, I think in respect for coal, I think the question is said something about should we consider coal. I mean, regardless of the CO2 emissions, it's still killing about 10 million people a day just from respiratory problems. I mean, that's argument enough to pass over that technology and start exploring and finding ways where we can actually make nuclear power cheaper than coal.
David, this one's probably for you from Paul Lindwall.
Yes, I read that one, yes.
Oh. Yep, so you can see that one?
Yes. So Paul's, it's a great question, Paul. So he's asking about, in my interactions with green groups that oppose nuclear and they assert climate change is the #1 problem in the world, how do they hold the position of banning something that can directly address their problems? Okay. So their general way of dealing with that is that they refer to nuclear energy as a dangerous distraction. They say this is something that's unnecessary. We have all the tools. They are economic. They are affordable. We have all the technologies that we need. This is simply a distraction that will put us off course to reducing carbon emissions. That's their basic position. Very few of them will argue on the safety and proliferation grounds, because, you know, I think the science is sort of pretty solidly on our side there. Some of them will argue on economic grounds. As I've already said, I don't believe economics is a justification for prohibition at all. In fact, I think it's a silly proposition. But yeah, they argue that it's a distraction, and that's how they reconcile that with their beliefs.
Well, it's Bob here. Can I just add a comment to that one, Lloyd? In my view, and I think Stuart was confirming this as well, actually nuclear is safer than rooftop solar. It sounds an amazing thing, but you haven't had a death in the nuclear industry for as long as I can remember, maybe longer. You know, every year there's about 1.5 million people in this world who are killed through motor accidents. Those are the UN statistics. And for every person that's killed through a motor accident, it could be 3 or 4 or 5 times the number who are badly injured. So that death toll and the accident toll globally are just huge. But, you know, you never hear people calling for banning of cars, do you? Banning of motor vehicles. What they do, they say, okay, look, we'll have them and we'll just regulate the use of motor vehicles. So they bring in prohibitions against drinking and driving. They tell you to drive on the left-hand side of the road or the right-hand side of the road or what have you. And, you know, people do have these risks in everyday life, which we tend to, because the motor vehicle industry has become so important to us, we tend to discount them. We tend to put up with them. Now, there's no need to put up with that sort of risk in the nuclear industry. You don't need to ban it. All you need to do is regulate it properly. There's the International Atomic Energy Agency there that have got a special convention on nuclear safety that was brought in after Chernobyl years ago. And that operates as a protective mechanism for all the populations of the world that are involved in nuclear power. And
definitely agree. Sorry to interrupt here, but we are reaching the end of this very fascinating conversation. I think we've all had a really good time and we've all learned a lot. Now, I will be having to end the conversation here because we need to move on to our next breakout session. However, you don't have to leave just yet if you don't want. I will be unmuting all of the participants, and whoever would like to stay, including our speakers, to just have a chat, please feel free to do so. If not, we're just going to go ahead and finish it off here. So I want to really thank you all for joining us. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us as well, to the speakers. And we will see you for the next conversation, I hope.